The moment carried the weight of 1,000 unspoken frustrations. It wasn't just a clash of personalities. It was an eruption long in the making, born from years of tension simmering beneath a polished surface. The energy in the room changed. Almost instantly, the mood flipping from light-hearted banter to a silence so thick it could be sliced with a knife. The exchange didn't need to be loud to be explosive. It was in the subtle jabs, the clipped tone, the stare that held too long. This wasn't a staged disagreement or a moment of contrived entertainment. It was raw, uncomfortable, and entirely unscripted. The build-up had been deceptively casual. For a while, everything unfolded with the usual rhythm. A few jokes, polite nods, the expected interplay between host and guest. But there was something different in the air, an edge that slowly crept in, growing more apparent with each passing minute. What began as a difference of opinion gradually escalated into something far more intense. The words were carefully chosen, each one cutting deeper than the last, and even though no voices were raised, the intensity was palpable. A storm was brewing beneath the surface, and everyone watching could feel it. As the exchange took a more serious tone, the atmosphere shifted. The laughter from the audience died down, replaced by a curious silence, the kind that usually only happens when people stop being entertained and start paying real attention. There was discomfort on the set, not just from the two on camera, but from everyone behind the scenes as well. The cameras kept rolling, capturing every subtle flicker of emotion, the tight grip on the armrest, the clenched jaw, the narrowing eyes. The set was still lit, the mic still live, but the performance had dropped. This wasn't for show anymore. There was a pause, a breath held too long. The air grew thicker with tension, and that's when the inevitable happened. The energy could no longer be contained within the boundaries of the studio setting. The choice to walk away wasn't a stunt or a joke, it was a line being drawn in real time. The sudden exit served not as a moment of drama, but as a final punctuation mark on a conversation that had spiraled far beyond recovery. It was spontaneous, yet definitive, a message not just to the person across the room, but to everyone watching. It said more than any follow-up explanation ever could. And in that moment, the space left behind became the loudest part of the story. The empty chair, the lingering silence, the shocked expressions all around. It spoke volumes. There was no need for apologies, no need for clarification. The audience had witnessed something unfiltered. The boundaries of civility and showmanship had collided with personal conviction, and what remained was the raw honesty of someone who refused to continue pretending. It wasn't about winning or losing an argument. It was about recognizing when a line had been crossed and choosing self-respect over continuation. In the aftermath, conversations inevitably buzzed. Viewers debated, dissected, speculated. But beneath the noise was the simple truth. Sometimes stepping away is more powerful than staying put. Sometimes the bravest thing a person can do is leave a space that no longer feels right. And that's exactly what happened. No fanfare, no dramatic speeches, just a silent, resolute departure that made its point louder than words ever could. It began with an almost imperceptible shift in the tone of conversation. What started as light-hearted banter slowly gave way to a tension that grew thicker with every exchange. One moment, everything seemed like part of the usual routine. Witty remarks, a bit of playful sarcasm, maybe even a sharp comment or two to liven up the interaction. But beneath the laughter, something deeper was unfolding. A seemingly innocuous question, an offhand comment, perhaps a poorly timed joke, whatever the trigger, it sparked a response that couldn't be disguised by performance. The air changed, and so did the energy on the set. It was the kind of moment that's hard to explain but impossible to miss. Body language shifted. The smiles looked tighter, less sincere. The pauses between responses grew longer, more deliberate. The interplay, which usually thrived on rhythm and timing, began to unravel. Instead of a smooth back and forth, there was friction, words with a little too much weight behind them, looks that lingered too long, hands fidgeting in laps. It wasn't the kind of disagreement designed for laughs or entertainment. It had slipped past that. It was personal now. What made the moment so captivating wasn't just the disagreement itself, but the way it was handled. There was no shouting match, no public unraveling. Instead, the heat came from subtle shifts, a deliberate tone, a furrowed brow, a remark that carried more meaning than the words suggested. It was like watching two people speak entirely different languages, neither willing to yield, both navigating, a conversation with emotional undercurrents just barely hidden. What once felt like a casual exchange had evolved into something far more intimate and complex. And then, there was that spark, that undeniable moment where pride, principle, and personality collided. It wasn't one-sided. There was equal resistance on both ends, a tug of war between ideologies, values, or perhaps just ego. What had started as a discussion veered into a collision. Each word became a small act of defiance, a refusal to back down, a stand for something that couldn't quite be named but was deeply felt. You could almost feel the temperature in the room rise. The silence between the sentences was no longer empty. It was charged, heavy with everything that wasn't being said out loud. As the tension reached its peak, the audience sensed it too. The laughter stopped. The applause cues felt misplaced. The illusion of the set, the lighting, the crowd, none of it could shield the reality of what was happening. There was discomfort, not because of anything outrageous or offensive, but because the performance had cracked and something real had slipped through. The exchange was no longer about entertainment. It was a confrontation, quiet and composed, but undeniably genuine. What followed wasn't chaos. It was a calculated decision. When the conversation finally hit that invisible wall, when no ground could be found between the two, a choice was made. Not to shout louder, not to push further, but to walk away. The exit itself wasn't dramatic, but it was firm. No grand declarations, no flurry of emotion. Just the end of engagement, the refusal to continue playing a game that had clearly stopped being fun. It wasn't about embarrassment or defeat. It was about reclaiming space, dignity, and control. The room didn't quite know how to react. A hush fell, the kind that stretches longer than expected. Those watching, whether live or through screens, were left to interpret what had just happened. And that was the brilliance of it, the ambiguity. No explanations, no justifications. Only the aftershock of a moment where civility met conviction, where someone decided enough was enough. It reminded everyone that even in the most controlled environments, real emotion has a way of breaking through. And when it does, it speaks, louder than any scripted line ever could. Sometimes it isn't the words that carry the most weight, but the stillness between them. In that moment, when the atmosphere on set turned brittle and uncertain, it was the silence that did all the talking. There was a noticeable shift, a collective awareness that something significant was unfolding. The usual rhythm of conversation halted. What remained was a tension so vivid it seemed to hang in the air like humidity before a thunderstorm. Cameras kept rolling, lights still burned bright, but the mood had changed entirely. It was no longer about the show. It had slipped into something far more human. The energy in the room became fragile. Each movement, every glance, felt magnified. A sip of water, a twitch of the mouth, the way fingers tapped against the chair's armrest, all of it betrayed the discomfort that words couldn't quite express. The invisible wall between performance and authenticity had been shattered. Everyone, from the crew behind the scenes to the audience members watching quietly from their seats, sensed that they were no longer witnessing a planned exchange. What they were seeing was real, unfiltered, unrehearsed, and that rawness gave the moment an almost cinematic weight. People often expect confrontation to be loud, dramatic, even explosive. But this wasn't that. This was something colder, sharper, and arguably more powerful. The back and forth lacked volume but not intensity. It was measured and deliberate, the kind of dialogue that cuts deeper precisely because it avoids theatrics. When someone draws a line without raising their voice, the silence that follows can be far more deafening than a shouted argument. The tension became not just a part of the moment. It was the moment. It filled the room, pressed against the walls, seeped into every breath taken. Viewers, both in the audience and at home, didn't need context to understand what was happening. The emotional cues were unmistakable. Discomfort registered in tightened shoulders and sidelong glances. Technicians behind the cameras stopped moving. Producers backstage stopped whispering. Time seemed to stretch as the standoff hovered in limbo. It wasn't about who was right or wrong. It wasn't even about the subject of disagreement anymore. It had become a moment of emotional truth, something that pierced through the polish and artificiality of the environment it occurred in. What made this so compelling was the vulnerability it exposed. Moments like this don't get rehearsed. There's no script that prepares someone for the point where a conversation tips into something personal. It felt like watching someone wrestle with their sense of control, unsure whether to retreat or push forward. And for the viewers, that hesitation, that real-time internal conflict, was gripping, because it didn't feel like a show anymore. It felt like real life, with all its awkwardness, messiness, and unresolvable emotion. As the moment stretched, there came a flicker, almost imperceptible, when it was clear a decision had been made. It could be seen in a shift of posture, the brief hardening of an expression, the quiet sigh that slipped through. Without ceremony, the conversation ended, not with a conclusion or a mutual understanding, but with a quiet departure. No dramatics, no storming. Just a break in the moment, and then a deliberate walk away. The space that was left behind felt heavier than before, as though the absence carried more meaning than the presence ever could. In the seconds that followed, no one quite knew what to do. The room remained frozen. It was as if everyone was waiting to see whether it was part of the act. But it wasn't. It was real, and that reality sank in slowly but unmistakably. In the world of curated moments and entertainment tailored to perfection, this unscripted departure cut through like a shard of truth. And truth, when delivered with quiet conviction, has a way of lingering long after the moment ends. That's what made the silence so unforgettable. Not just its presence, but its power. It became a character in the moment, speaking volumes where words fell short. It stood for discomfort, defiance, disappointment, all the things that couldn't be said aloud. And for everyone who witnessed it, it served as a quiet reminder that sometimes the most powerful statements are made without saying anything at all. The act of walking away often speaks louder than any argument ever could. There are moments where The act of walking away often speaks louder than any argument ever could. There are moments where words fail to bridge the gap between two opposing minds, where continuing the conversation feels less like dialogue and more like surrender. In such instances, choosing to leave becomes an assertion, not of defeat, but of boundaries. It's a decision rooted in self-preservation, a quiet refusal to be complicit in something that no longer feels authentic or worthwhile. And in that specific moment, the choice to exit wasn't a flourish for attention. It was a calculated response to a dynamic that had lost its balance. As the tension built to an almost unbearable level, it became clear that there was no resolution on the horizon. The conversation, once perhaps intended to entertain or enlighten, had slipped into something else entirely, an impasse. Each sentence grew heavier with subtext, the pauses between them more pronounced. There was no longer any sense of progress or mutual understanding, only a deepening divide. And when someone recognizes that a discussion is no longer moving forward, only circling the same exhausted points, they are often faced with two choices: stay and endure, or step away and reclaim their space. Choosing to leave was not an impulsive act. It was a culmination. The emotional weight of the exchange had built up slowly, like water pressing against a dam. From the outside, it may have looked sudden, but anyone paying close attention could see the warning signs: the tightening jaw, the shift in body language, the clipped replies. Those moments, seemingly insignificant on their own, were small fractures in the dam. And when it finally gave way, the release wasn't explosive, it was precise. A movement, deliberate and unspoken, that said everything that needed to be said. The silence that followed was more revealing than any explanation could have been. It wasn't just the absence of sound, it was the presence of something unspoken, something understood instinctively by everyone in the room. The crew fell still. The audience, once brimming with laughter and energy, sat in uneasy quiet. This wasn't a rehearsed exit. There was no dramatic music, no closing line, no curtain falling. It was a simple gesture, standing up, stepping away, that carried more impact than any scripted finale, and in its simplicity lay its power. There's something universally human about moments like these. Everyone, at some point, has found themselves in a space where their values, comfort, or dignity have been tested. To choose to walk away in those moments is to draw a line, one that isn't drawn out of anger or pride, but out of self-respect. And for those watching, the moment resonates not because of its spectacle, but because of its relatability. It serves as a reminder that we are all allowed to leave when something no longer feels right, no matter how public or high stakes the setting. In the wake of the departure, the room seemed to hold its breath. What was left behind wasn't chaos, but reflection. People looked around, unsure of what came next. The absence created a space that demanded attention, not to the drama, but to the principle behind the action. The conversation was over, not because it had reached a conclusion, but because continuing it would have meant compromising something more important. And that unspoken understanding gave the act a kind of elegance that no argument could ever match. What made the moment unforgettable was not its noise, but its clarity. It was the clarity of someone refusing to be part of something misaligned with their truth. That kind of clarity is rare, especially in spaces designed for performance. It cuts through pretense and expectation, leaving only authenticity in its wake. And for anyone witnessing it, the message couldn't have been clearer. There is strength in silence and power in walking away from anything that does not honor who you are. Long after the moment passed, people continued to talk, not about who said what, but about the quiet intensity of that decision. The visual of an empty chair, the fading echo of unresolved words, the subtle shift in atmosphere, it all stayed with them. Because in that act of leaving, a boundary was drawn, a statement made, not with volume, not with confrontation, but with unwavering certainty. It stood as a testament to the idea that sometimes the boldest move is not to fight harder, but to simply stand up and go. In the aftermath of a moment charged with emotion, silence, and departure, what lingers is not the clash itself, but the truth it revealed. The choice to disengage from a space that no longer felt right left behind something far more powerful than any final word could offer. It wasn't just a scene from a show or a footnote in a conversation, it was a vivid reminder of personal agency. In a world where people are often expected to smile through discomfort or compromise to keep the peace, taking a step back can become an act of quiet rebellion, a way of asserting, "This is where I end and you begin." The simplicity of that act often overshadows its weight. There were no fiery exits, no raised voices echoing across the stage. Just a pause, a choice, and the deliberate motion of walking away. That's what makes it memorable. It wasn't about spectacle. It was about self-awareness. It was about knowing when dialogue turns into noise, when debate turns into erosion, and when standing still becomes a form of surrender. To move on in that moment wasn't weakness. It was strength. And it was the kind of strength that didn't need applause to validate it. Audiences may forget the words spoken, the jokes exchanged, or even the topic of disagreement. But they remember the energy. They remember how the room felt when everything stopped being a performance. There's something timeless about authenticity, about watching someone choose truth over obligation. It strikes a chord with anyone who's ever faced a moment where walking away was the only choice that honored their integrity. That's what resonates long after the cameras stop rolling and the stage lights dim. What unfolded wasn't just an unscripted television moment. It was a reflection of something more universal. It touched on boundaries, on values, on knowing when to protect one's peace rather than argue for it. These are decisions people face every day, often quietly, and usually without a spotlight. But when such a decision plays out publicly, it serves as a mirror. It reminds everyone watching that it's okay to leave the table when respect is no longer being served. And so, while there was no resolution in the traditional sense, no handshake, no agreement reached, there was closure in the form of clarity. A line was drawn. A message was sent. And it didn't need to be spoken to be heard. In fact, it was the absence of explanation that made it so powerful. Because sometimes the most profound statements come not from what is said, but from what is chosen instead of saying anything at all. It's in the silence, the stillness, and ultimately